All right, greetings from the Dark Continent. Terrible natural lighting caracal here. And we're doing a special episode today where we're talking in the morning. So good morning to everyone. But this is because my guest is starting work next week. So he's going to be very preoccupied and he's going to leave his more COVID-19 activistic ways or researching hobby behind, I think, for a while, or maybe not. Maybe he will continue. So today I'm talking to Hügo Krüger. He's been on my my Afrikaans podcast, the Another Adams podcast, and we've talked about COVID-19 and the data and what the experts are saying and where the experts are actually disagreeing and where they got it wrong. And Hügo is not, he doesn't have a specific background in medicine or any type of medical field, but he has a very strong interest in it. And he also is an avid researcher. So I think he will be able to give us a lot of interesting insights. I've definitely been able to learn a lot from the things that he sent me in terms of links and the things that he's put on Twitter as the pandemic developed. So good morning and welcome, Hügo.
Thank you for having me. Now, just to clarify my position, I am not a medical expert. I am actually a structural engineer, and I've got a lot of work experience in analytics, if that ever qualifies me. But I just have a strong opinion on things.
And I think another thing that you've become known for now, as in the podcast sphere in South Africa, is you've actually had COVID-19 and recovered, correct?
Yes, I am a COVID survivor. I know my status. So far, it's been not been a very difficult disease to survive, as we all should know by now. I was sick for the symptoms I had for about 7 days, but I was only in bed for 2 days. And I suspect if I didn't go out for a walk, I probably would have, not even been in bed.
Right, and you're not currently in South Africa. You're actually overseas. You're residing in France at the moment, right?
Yeah, that's correct. So I stay in Paris, in the center of the epicenter in Europe. And I've been here for almost 5 years.
So now, maybe just as a bit of an introduction to the conversation, where did your interest in the data surrounding COVID-19 come from, and this interest to research all the different types of policy approaches that have been tried across the world?
So it's interesting. I obviously work as a structural engineer, but I do a lot of analysis. And engineers are a funny species. As soon as there's something strange happening, we like to draw our own statistics about, just following the trends to see if we can spot patterns, to see if we can be ahead of the chemical guy. So there's a guy in my office who's from Lebanon, a good friend of mine, and he was, showing me, worldometer. We were debating the curves over coffee in the office. And then what really piqued my interest, there's a very clever doctor in France called Didier Raoult, and he became a Twitter sensation before this. He never had a Twitter account before this pandemic, but now he's got about 500,000 followers, which is something extraordinary. During a pandemic, you can actually become popular. And this doctor, who happened to be the world's most cited expert in infectious diseases. And from the very beginning, he came out with this drug, hydroxychloroquine. He came out criticizing heavily the French approach. He was part of Emmanuel Macron's Council of Haute Science, High Scientific Advisory, and he walked out of the council saying, "You know what? I'm going to be better serving my community, treating my patients, and the councils and these guys are playing politics. They don't want to listen to what I'm saying." So, because of this, the Twitterati likes a contrarian. They like somebody that goes against the grain. And if you happen to be a very well-cited expert in infectious diseases, everyone follows you. It doesn't matter what you say sometimes. So I was listening to his criticism, first of all, and saying, what is he saying? And in the beginning, he said that the statistics do not make any sense because different countries were testing at different rates. Some people at different countries had different strategies. A lot of these things came down to earth. And then I started digging a bit different. I tried to get different opinions. And then I came across a guy called John Ioannidis in the United States. Now, Dr. John Ioannidis is a bit of a superstar among medical researchers. He's one of the pioneers of evidence-based medicine. And throughout his career, he has developed tests and measurements to eliminate bias in data. Because this comes now from my laboratory experience. When you work with data, you always need to ask yourself, am I not fooling myself? And are the people around not fooling myself? And this is why we have a peer review process. This is why something such as randomized controlled trials exist. There's different types of ways to try and eliminate biases which are in human nature. because humans have especially confirmation bias. There's a bias called the halo bias. If you look beautiful, I trust you more than somebody looks awful. There's a one that I like is a bias that we tend to trust people that speak with confidence and not people that doubt themselves. And if you think about it, you actually need to listen to the guy that's doubting himself because he's thinking his arguments through. Anyway, so Johnny Anidas is an expert in analyzing it. And he wrote a very interesting article, I can't remember the date now, beginning of this year, saying we are making very dangerous decisions on faulty data. Then I read...
And this was early in this year already.
This was early in this year after the Diamond Princess ship, because he used the data from the Diamond Princess ship, and he said, guys, if what happens to the Diamond Princess is representative of the US population, the amount of people that will die of this virus is at maximum 3 times seasonal flu. It's not 10 times. Then, I started reading into the models of Imperial College. I tried to understand the model. It ended up very complicated, very exoteric. Nobody could understand it, including the epidemiologists themselves. And Niall Ferguson predicted 500,000 people in the UK will die, for example. This proved to be just blatantly false. His model was based on faulty inputs, and it was based on the assumption that nothing humanly possible is being done. But they didn't take into account people washed their hands, that the UK population did change their behavior as soon as the virus breaks out. So, as these things became clear from different angles, I started realizing that the statistics are not making sense on one end and the models are not making sense. And here we are locking up human civilization on faulty data and faulty statistics. And this to me is a consequence of the thing not being debated. So throughout the last 2 months, I've been reading a lot, digging on a lot of data, and trying to make sense of it for myself, not claiming to be any expert, but I think I've learned a great deal about infectious diseases, just out of pure interest and the data and sampling,
So now something that we've talked about on our Afrikaans podcast that I think is very fascinating is we've been doing these types of conversations almost on a 2-weekly basis, so we could see how the global approach to the disease had been progressing. And something that we always talked about, or something that we always touched on, was the difference between what you're experiencing or experienced in France and what we are experiencing or experienced in South Africa. But I mean, you are keeping a close eye on South Africa for obvious reasons, so I don't think I need to inform you on the majority of things that are going on here. But could you maybe just give us a very quick summary of the differences in approach, or actually the similarities, if it's the case?
So I'll sort of group the strategies, more or less 3 strategies that a country can follow. The first one is herd immunity. It's basically Sweden followed it. And the UK did it initially onwards. Then you have what we call lockdown. Lockdown meaning we close down the whole society. In France, it's called confinement. And so is it called in Italy. Lockdown basically means I close down everything. I assume people are going to freeze in place, and I assume the virus is going to die because people won't be moving around, or the transmission rate is low, so the hospitals can cope. So that's where the term came, flattening the curve. Then there's another one, the third strategy, which in my view was the correct strategy, but only works early on, which is mass testing. You saw it in Germany, you saw it in Iceland, you saw it in I think Norway did a lot of testing as well. You saw it in South Korea. Very early on, if you test very quickly, you can spot the people who are carriers of the virus, and you can stop it from spreading. So different countries have different approaches. South Africa's similarity was it went for lockdown without mass testing. South Africa's data until today, I don't have a lot of confidence in the data. To the extent that it's representative, it probably represents severe cases. Now, to give you an idea, most people who have this virus will not, show any symptoms. So we don't know how many people have got the virus. We just might know how many people are in hospital for the virus. The danger of this strategy is that it means that some people are still symptomatic, walking around. We aren't tracing them, and they're coughing on other people. And if they keep on coughing, the virus will keep on spreading. And what the countries who went for lockdown approach did is they initially got epidemiologists to give them models to try and predict where the virus is going to spread. And South Africa has been doing it, the UK did it, France did it. And the problem with prediction is, I think there's a quote in the Bible, Matthew something, that you cannot know the future. You cannot know what is going to come. So you're only speculating. It's like speculating on the stock price and then tomorrow it crashes. So this is dangerous. We used predictive models, and we assumed that the model is going to do, the virus is going to do. And it seems to me that all the models have been just proven wrong time and time again, because nobody knows what the future is going to hold. So without collecting sensible data, your strategy is akin to guesswork. So that's the similarity between South Africa and France. The difference is that the French were not entirely stupid. they did not ban cigarettes, because a lot of French smoke. They didn't ban alcohol and wine. Where they were stupid, though, they said that not everyone can use the public transport system, and every second seat needs to be left open. So they had some strict measures, which were, in my view, blatantly ridiculous. They limited the amount of people in the supermarket, for example. I got infected in a supermarket despite limitations. It doesn't work because they didn't know who had the virus. You don't test people in the supermarket. How do you know they've got a virus? How do you know if the 40 people have got it or the 100 people outside in the queue? So all these type of measures were, unscientifically followed in France and South Africa. South Africa just took it to an extreme. And in my view, it's one of the most brutal lockdowns in the world.
No, I think brutal is definitely the right word. I like the fact that there in France, you guys call it the confinement rather than a lockdown. I think it's a bit more accurate.
But well, the actual word people should use for this is there's two words. Either you can use house arrest, which is South Africa's doing, or we can call it what we used to call it, which is quarantine. But in the past, we used to quarantine the sick, not the healthy with the sick. And this is the big flaw in the lockdown strategy, is that you put people who are symptomatic and asymptomatic and not infected together in one home, and then you hope they're not going to infect each other. Now, if you look at New York statistics and in Spain, there's two studies that came out, which is quite frightening. In Spain, they had a lot of essential workers, however you define that. And they had obviously non-essential workers who had to stay home. And they found out in Spain that more people got infected who stayed home than those who were actually working during the whole pandemic. The same was true of New York. So the reasoning is that the assumption was that people would stay in home, and because they stay at home, they won't get infected. But they didn't take into account all the mechanisms of how the virus spreads, and a lot of people got infected in their homes, not in the street. And the basic thing, sunshine, for example, stimulates vitamin D. You're less likely to be infected if you have IV, or less likely to develop symptoms if you have vitamin D, for example. Then it's also just a thing, if you cramp people in their homes, the immune system breaks down. So a lot of the measures which were taken, in my view, were completely unscientific, but all the governments were claiming that they were following the science. There's not a single government that said they didn't follow the science. And I think there's never been a time that this phrase, we are following the science, has been completely devoid of meaning.
And but now talking about, the title of this episode is When the Experts Get It Wrong. And one of the names that we've talked about a lot on my other podcast is this Niall Ferguson, the man whose projections were the bedrock of a lot of these lockdowns. Could you maybe elaborate a bit more on his contribution to the world that we're living in today? I think it's something that we can't afford to ignore.
Yeah, so Niall Ferguson is an interesting character. He's a physicist, apparently, by training originally. He's not an epidemiologist even, but it seems to me you don't need to do a lot of complicated mathematics to be an epidemiologist. He, as before this lockdown, had a very dodgy record of predictions. He predicted that a few 100,000 people would die in Ebola, which happened to be a few thousand. He predicted that swine flu would have amounts of deaths. I don't know the numbers now. And then there's a very sad tragedy, in my view, which is the foot-and-mouth disease breakout in the UK, where he predicted that a lot of cows would have foot-and-mouth disease. Ended up being 8 cows. A lot of farmers had to slaughter their livestock because of his predictions. A lot of farmers committed suicide. It was a few years ago. This was investigated by the journalist Peter Hitchens. So my question is, if a guy has a dodgy record of predictions, doesn't matter what his models is, why do we give him so much sway? So he published a paper, I think it was March, must have been the week March 26. I have my dates, a bit screwed up. But essentially, he said that 500,000 people in the UK will die according to his model. That paper wasn't peer-reviewed, but it was influential because his name was influential. So it influenced the WHO. It's still being used by WHO's predictions. It influenced the UK government, the French government, the German government, South African government, USA. The only government that said, wait, this is a bit of nonsense, was the Swedish government. They said it can't be. We looked at data. The data doesn't make sense. How can you predict? We are going to follow a different approach. But the fact is that a computer model, influenced the decisions of many governments worldwide. And there has to be a book written as to why this happened, that we followed one model. And I have a suspicion, and it's something which I can get in a bit later in, but just getting at models are dangerous. This is the lesson from all of this. Don't follow a model without having context, without having data, without looking at the near facts. The model is a vision. If you follow a vision without looking as to where the vision is restrained by reality, you end up with what we've done. So I suspect this was mass panic as well. And you can. It's not just Ferguson that has to be blamed. The governments worldwide have to be blamed for following something which was a doomsday scenario without asking the question, is it peer reviewed? Can we have a second opinion? Does the data, correspond with this? None of these questions were asked.
There are a lot of similarities between this that come to mind for me, between this type of predictions and following the models blindly, and that story in South Africa of the oracle telling her people that they need to kill all their livestock in order for the white man to be chased into the sea.
There's two historical precedents for me. The one is the Xhosa woman, was it Nkwazi? My name pronunciation is bad. Who said, kill all the livestock. But there's another one, which is the Dutch tulip mania of the 17th centuries. And all the Dutch at that stage invested their money on future values of tulip prices. It was the first, I believe, future value, being used. I don't really understand derivative markets, but it's the first form of a derivative market, probably, elementary to what we have today. But the Dutch invested money into the future price of tulips. Now, you don't need to be an economist or speculator or financial advisor to think that's crazy. Where's the common sense? The 2008 financial crisis also sets a precedent because a lot of investors followed what we call the Black-Scholes model. Not all of them followed it, but it gave an indication on the security of the derivative market. And because people followed models like a bunch of monkeys, they realized that, hey, reality contradicts the model. So this is something humans do. I have an explanation as to why it happened. And I messaged the guy, Jim Flynn, who is the author of the Flynn Effect. Flynn Effect says that every successive generation has a higher IQ than their parents. And a lot of people misinterpreted that we are more intelligent than our parents. And what higher IQ meant is that you can take rational, abstract reasoning more seriously. And my view is that we are living in a modern world where computers are everywhere, models are everywhere, simulations are everywhere. You can prove anything with an Excel spreadsheet in a simulation. And we have a generation which has now been brought up with this technology, and it came at a cost. And if you go back to what our grandparents knew, our grandparents did not know a lot about modeling, reasoning, and hypothetical reasoning. They would tell you it works, it doesn't work. They had a world which was based on testimony. And the problem in their world was that they couldn't see contradictions in moral reasoning. For example, if I say to you, what if you're Irish? What if you're black? What if you're like this? I'm posing a hypothetical question to you. And immediately, if you apply it to yourself, you can see that a lot of the rules and the absurdities we lived in were wrong. So moral progress came as a consequence of higher IQ. But we lost something. And what we lost, in my view, is testimony. We lost asking the basic question, does it work? Is this factually true? Does data contradict reality? So the truth lies somewhere between your model and your data.
Basically asking the question, does it work when the tire hits the pavement or when the tire hits the road? It's that practical knowledge that I think characterizes the vast majority of human history, and only recently that we entered this era of models and projections. I think you're completely on the money there.
I mean, there's another book on this which was written by John Ralston Saul, which is a Canadian philosopher, called Voltaire's Bastards. And it was written the year before I was born, 1989. And he made the argument that worldwide we have universities which are essentially training kids, students, to become, technocrats. They are trained with case studies. They are trained in datafying everything. I mean, you take education, for example. Kids are measured in data points. And you ask yourself, can you really measure a kid, his performance on a score sheet? But everything has gone to score sheets. Yeah, everything has gone to modeling reasoning. And universities, in my view, are responsible for driving this type of thinking. Now, where the philosophy of reason came in is in the 16th and 17th century, where a lot of the aristocracy and a lot of the priestly class really believed in absurdities, witches and all this type of nonsenses. And reason was a development to counteract it. But like anything in life, people have taken too far away. I don't think you can judge everything in life on a case study. You cannot do it all in scenario planning. You cannot do it all on a scorecard. There's some things that must be judged on what we used to call common sense. And this is the lesson for me in all of this. It's a big tragedy because common sense just went out of the window. We handed it over to experts who had scenarios of the future. And I would like to see how many of these scenarios came out to be true. Probably 1 in 1,000. And you know what people are going to do? They say, listen to that 1 in 1,000 guy, without realizing he might have been wrong. People not asking the basic question, can you really predict the future of a virus spreading? We don't even know what the virus is. We don't know how people are going to react. None of these questions were asked. We just said the model represents reality.
Mm. But now that we've been exposed to this pandemic or to this lockdown culture, if you will, for at least 3 months now, or let's say quite a few months. What have we learned from the different paths that people took or countries took? I mean, like we've stipulated earlier, not every country took the same approach. Some countries took radically different approaches. What have we learned? At the beginning, I know it was naive to say, but well, this will definitely work, or this will definitely work, or this approach is working in this country. But I think enough time has passed now where we can pretty accurately say, well, this has worked better than this.
So I've gotten a theory there that the law of nature worked in most places. Say that why? Japan did absolutely nothing, very close to nothing. My sister stays in Japan. They had schools closed a bit, or the kids couldn't go to school, so the teacher could go. Japan has fewer deaths than most countries. We don't even know if the spike in deaths is due to the panic caused by the virus, or is it because of the virus, or is it because of another disease? So there's the only guy I took seriously in this whole pandemic is that Didier Raoult. So he's the guy I took the most serious. And he said from the beginning, we're misunderstanding the mechanisms of the virus. Let's get back to how a virus spreads. Forget about your models and your theories and all this nonsense. A virus spreads because you're coughing on me. You are the carrier of the virus. So if a country has a strategy to target the carrier of the virus, test somebody, trace him, put him in quarantine, you're going to stop the virus from spreading. That's the first point. Okay, so that worked in South Korea, for example. They were very quickly on the ball. They track and trace, put the people in in isolation who had the virus, and the virus didn't spread. It worked in New Zealand wonderfully as well. Then there's another thing which he said, which people are missing, and that is that a virus doesn't die because we have herd immunity. A lot of people still believe in herd immunity. The virus is dying in Europe, and 20 or 30% of people might have had the virus. Herd immunity assumes statistically 60 or 70%. Now, herd immunity helps. We vaccinate kids to build up herd immunity. It's not that there's nothing to it, but it's not the mechanism that kills the virus. What kills a virus is a change in ecology, whether it's the season, but it's not just the season, the temperature. You must be very careful when we say that. If you have one old person in an old age home, for example, and that person starts coughing, automatically the conditions in that old age home is favorable for the virus to reproduce. So what do you need to do? Spread the old people out, maybe. That's a very good thing. All the countries that have high deaths have got lots of old people in old age homes. And I think in Texas, like 40% of people, in the UK and Sweden is similar. People that died in old age home. Why? Because the conditions inside a home is a death trap. The virus loves that. The virus likes that ecology. The virus does not like an ecology where there's a lot of young people. Okay, because young people don't show symptoms, so it doesn't reproduce as fast. Transmission rate is lower. The virus doesn't like an ecology of high density versus low densification, for example. If it likes high density, it doesn't like low densification. New York and London and Stockholm was harder hit than the rest of the countries they're in. So ecology is an important one. Washing your hands, keeping things clean. So you change the ecology of the room and your surroundings to be more favorable to destroy the virus. And then there's just a thing that, you take flu, for example. Flu does not infect the entire population every year. It infects 10, 20, I don't know what percentage, and then a certain percentage of those people die. So there is a law of nature, and I think people were a bit naive to think we can model this and follow the models to do it. So track and trace targeting the mechanism which the virus spreads works. Cleaning your home works a little bit. But then there's also just the acceptance that if you have a lot of old people in the country, like Italy, you would be naive to think that there won't be deaths.
Now, you were talking about these types of favorable conditions. Now, I think this is something that we talked about on my other podcast as well, and that is the question about the hemispheres. How clear and how solid is the data on the difference between how the virus spreads and how deadly it is, comparing between the southern and the northern hemisphere?
Well, it's not that obvious because the northern hemisphere, okay, the virus is dying because we can say it's summer. It might just be because the virus has peaked. In the southern hemisphere, it seems to be rebounding, especially in South Africa. I haven't seen a rebound in Australia and New Zealand yet, but I won't be surprised if that happens. It's winter. It's a better ecosystem for the virus. But then you have the anomaly of Brazil. Brazil has had viruses peak, and it's a very warm country. It's in the southern hemisphere. So you simply don't know. And I think if a lot of people from the beginning said that we don't know about this virus, we'd be in a much better position. I think there was far too many convictions without having evidence to substantiate it. It might also just be because of density. The southern hemisphere is less dense in general than the northern hemisphere, with the exception of Brazil. Brazil's favelas, I think it's called, is a highly dense area. It's the only place in the Southern Hemisphere that's really dense. So there's some cities in Sydney and some place in Sydney, and I think in Auckland as well, that's very dense. But generally, the Southern Hemisphere is less dense than the Northern Hemisphere. So I don't expect the virus to be propagating that much. We don't know what happens when it enters Johannesburg. We actually don't even know in South Africa if it's already peaked. For all we know, the virus might have been through the country. And the only way you can prove that is by doing a serological test, do an antibody test and see the distribution. And to my knowledge, South Africa is banning antibody tests from being done, because they don't want to be proven that they reacted too late. I mean, it makes no sense for me that the virus waits for African time to spread. In South Africa, at flights from Wuhan, I'm not sure if it was directly going to Johannesburg, December, January. Why wasn't the virus propagating then? Why did we react late? So there's something dodgy about the South African testing. I suspect that in some places in the country, the virus have peaked already. Some places like Cape Town, maybe it hasn't. And the reason I say this, if you look at California, there was a big flu epidemic in California in December. Nobody noticed it was a flu epidemic. And now they suspect those might have been COVID deaths. So the other question here is, would we have had so many deaths, or would we have noticed it if the media wasn't focusing on it? And I suspect we would have had fewer deaths, because I suspect the panic killed a lot more people that would have otherwise survived.
But now, I think when the lockdown started, a lot of our the South African lockdown specifically, and a lot of lockdowns across the world, were pretty much looking towards, at that time, towards Italy as this horror story that scared a lot of people and actually got a lot of people terrified. But now that we're looking at the current state of the world, Italy has kind of dropped off. But what went wrong there, from what you can see in that early stage when Italy was like the whole world was focusing on them, and it was really this absolute just horror story? What happened there specifically that made that situation transpire in that way?
So what you need to understand about Italy is Italy is essentially the China or the Witbank of Europe. Anyone who's been to Witbank would know that the air there is horrible. So the virus was going to do very well there regardless of what you did. Italy has a very old population. What happened in Italy, I suspect I'm actually not so sure on the Italian front, but I know in Spain, the Minister of Health in Spain said that this is just going to be flu. It's not going to be serious. So there's also in Italy a big distrust between authority and the people living there. And when your government tells you something, generally the Italians think that they're lying to you. They're probably right as well. It's in South Africa, it's the assumption we take as well. So you find that the countries who had trust with their governments did better. Those who didn't trust their governments, they acted like the Italians. The Italians also, like South Africans, have a tradition of breaking the rules. The one newspaper in Rome said, for example, for the first time in 2,000 years that Italians are expected to follow the rules. Okay, so the Italians don't follow the rules as much as we do. Then they also have intergenerational families living together. Anyone who's had Italian friends know that the mother and the father and the household, they all stay together. It's normal to them. So you expect the virus to spread a bit better in places like this. Why they reacted the way they did, I think books still has to be written. What went wrong and whether it worked as well. I know there's one town in Bergamo who's got, I think, the highest antibody percentage in the world. So the virus is spread there regardless of what they did. Maybe the lockdown came too late, maybe it came too early. One thing that they didn't do, they didn't test early on to know who actually had the virus and where it was. So I suspect that went wrong.
And something like you're talking about antibodies. I know a lot of people have been speculating, and there's stories floating around about people getting the virus for a second time, for a third time. What is the current consensus from the sources that you trust, from the experts that you add to?
So all cases of reinfection have proven to be false. It had to do with the PCR test, which gave false positives. But when they really investigated, nobody has had the virus twice yet. And I say yet because it might be that this virus is like flu, which the antibodies expire, and come next year, you can get flu again. You can have flu 2 years in a row. This is what a lot of people are worried about when they now talk about a second wave, that an antibody is not long-lasting. And then they are pushing for vaccination and saying, well, the reason we do flu vaccination is to get a certain percentage of the population covered every year, and then to make the antibodies resistant in the population so the virus will spread lower and lower. There's something to that. To say if there's a vaccine, I would probably take it if it's necessary. But I just want to say something on the vaccination, and this is I'm just quoting Didier Raoult on this, where he said to find a vaccination for a respiratory disease is in a sense an idiotic challenge. And the reason he's saying this is that the people who are susceptible of dying from COVID-19 are in their 80s, 70, 80s, they're old people. As you get older, unfortunately, we all have to die and our immune system gets weaker. So what a vaccine does is it sort of mimics what your body would have done had it been a virus without infecting you with the virus, to my understanding of it. So if you're going to vaccinate the old people, the resistance from that is not going to be as strong. And they might still get the virus. This is why people get their flu shots every year. And they sometimes get sick from the flu shot, or the flu, they actually still get the flu. What I suspect might be a better strategy if we go for vaccination, if there is a vaccine, is do what he suggests we need to do for flu. And understand that flu is carried from young people to old people, generally. Children carry the virus, but they're not, they don't have the virus themselves, because they play in schools with all the virus around them. And if you vaccinate kids every year, you actually have a higher percentage chance of protecting the grandparents. That's one strategy maybe, but now I've read also that there is suspicion that children might not even transfer this virus. So if there is a vaccine, I'm not against vaccines. I actually think vaccines is amazing. It is just that the vaccination strategy has to be logical and sensible to what the dynamics of the virus is and how it spreads. And it might make no sense to vaccinate old people. It might make no sense to vaccinate at all if there's even a vaccine. Because in London now, I see in the one study they're doing, they can't find enough people who have the virus for the vaccine trials. So the virus might actually just burn out and never come back again. That's also a possibility.
But now, on that note, do you reckon that this virus is just going to be a 2020, 2021 thing, or will this be added to the reservoir of all the? Will it find a reservoir somewhere and then reemerge, as, for example, we get with other types of coronavirus?
I don't know. I mean, it's will it be a reservoir for other viruses to emerge? I don't know. You don't know how that's going to play out. It's just time will tell. I suspect that the virus will become seasonal, like any other virus is going to be. And I suspect that as the virus propagates through the human population, our bodies will manipulate it so it is as weak as common cold is, which I suspect is already happening in any ways. And it won't be a worry for us in the future anymore.
Yeah, I see here there's a question for you in the chat. Ice ZA asks, Hügo, where did you read about South Africa looking to ban the antibody tests?
It was some. I asked, who was it? I think I asked Renewable on this. I don't remember if I might be mistaken. But I asked somebody of the authorities, and they say that laboratories can only do it for research purposes. They cannot do it for testing purposes, which is a mistake in my view, because the antibody test can tell you which area is infected and which area you can open up, if you went for lockdown. So to do it only for research, it doesn't make sense. But perhaps South Africa doesn't have the testing capacity, which I suspect. I mean, most of our tests came from the public sector, not the private sector, or from the private sector, not the public sector. So maybe we just don't have the test to test everyone. But the antibody test, in my view, is a simple thing. You just prick somebody, you take a blood sample, and you test for antibodies.
And I think the other thing that we need to talk about is definitely the red elephant in the room, and that is China, in terms of where this disease came from, or this virus came from. And also the country that it seems is the most worried about the fallout from this virus after it has passed and the world returns to normal and starts asking some questions. Now, let's maybe do an introduction to this part of the conversation with the question of, do you believe the numbers that China peaked at 80,000 cases and is now pretty much, for all intents and purposes, coronavirus free?
Yes and no. I mean, I perhaps in absolute number they're lying. In relative numbers, I think they're not lying more than most countries are. I don't think they've got an incentive to lie about this. What I suspect, though, is happening is that the Chinese government has put in place years ago a response for biological warfare. And this is why they were better prepared than most countries in the world. I suspect that this virus did come from the laboratory in Wuhan. I don't think it was humanly fabricated. I think it's just a bat virus. And I suspect this is why they reacted early as they did, because they thought it was a biological warfare weapon that came out. And I quote, this is not a conspiracy theory, I quote Sam Husseini, who's the journalist in America that's done a lot of research into this, who says that the laboratory in Wuhan does what we call gain of function research. So you take a virus, you try and make it more deadly. Luc Moukanuk, I think is the guy's name, I can't pronounce his surname now, is a French guy who discovered the HIV virus. And he said in the genome he discovered some pieces of the HIV virus. And then some other scientists say, no, but this is very just random. Okay. The point is not whether or not the virus was manipulated or not. The point is that there is biological warfare research going on, which is gain-of-function research, the majority of all, unfortunately, funded by the US government. And, if we are taking nuclear weapons seriously, shouldn't we be taking biological warfare weapons seriously? So I say that Chinese numbers, it might be 10 times more, it might be 5 times more, I don't know. I mean, it's as well as I do that I don't like communist regimes. I think they all lie. But what exactly they're lying about, I don't think the numbers is really what they're lying about. And I think it's more the research and all this type of things. Because their distribution in Hubei province, it's not out of proportion with the rest of Europe. If you take the population of Hubei province, they might be lying in the rest of China. But I don't think it's really a point we need to dwell on too much. The thing that we need to question is, why is there a laboratory in Wuhan which is doing gain-of-function research, which is making the viruses more deadly, and why has it been financed by the French and the American governments?
Right, and I think that's a very interesting point that we can elaborate on, is that whole idea of biological warfare and us entering a new era of weaponry, where nuclear weapons might not be the only thing that you can use as a stick to threaten your opponents with, or even defend yourself with. What are your thoughts on, just not coronavirus and COVID-19 aside, your thoughts on the future of biological warfare and what we might expect to see in the future? I know you don't like future predictions, but just a little bit of a picking of your brain there.
Well, I think this is going to be part of the new coming Cold War with China, which is already underway. But I can quote General Mattis, who's the American. He was a general under Trump before he got fired, who always says that we overestimate the ability of our enemies and underestimate our own. Biological warfare will be, I think, more of a psychological tool, in the same sense that nuclear weapons was. It's a deterrent. And it's trying to stop wars. It's all the stopping wars, but it's more for geopolitical advantage. We have now seen that the threat from biological warfare, if coronavirus is one, is not so much the amount of people that will die. It's the panic and the fear and the irrational decisions that the governments take as a consequence of it. And this is something that we need to get to grips with. Perhaps governments or societies need to have faster testing capacities. They need to have strategies in place to respond to this, to ease the fear of the public. It's a debate worth having. It is going to be used as leverage. The Chinese are already selling masks around the world and trying to paint their face well, but I think people aren't buying it. The governments might be buying it, but I don't think the average South African believes that the Chinese have got good intentions. I think quite the contrary. So it is something that can backfire on them. Just on laboratory leakages, apparently there's been over 100 leakages in biological warfare. Most of it's been anthrax, which was researched, by different governments. Apparently there was one closer to home by the Rhodesian government, which was supported by South Africa in the apartheid years, where we also did biological warfare. Forget Wouter Basson did biological warfare, where he tried to take bacteria and try to make it more contagious. This is gain-of-function research. So it is a biological warfare weapon, and we need to think of the psychological weapon behind it, not so much using it. Because we've seen from China, if you use it, it's going to be used on every country. Why do you want to inflict a wound on yourself?
Back around to you.
Yeah, definitely.
But now, if you look at, for example, you mentioned there the repercussions for China and people not really buying their story. What do you envision after this whole pandemic? Do you think the world will decouple themselves from Chinese production lines, or do you think we will just go back to normal, or even be more dependent, or increasingly dependent on China, as was the trajectory before this pandemic?
So China has, let me first try by understanding China. China has a lot of internal structural problems. The first thing is most of its people stay on the coastlines. They don't stay in the inner country. It's barely anyone living there despite doing this. They've got separatist movements in Tibet and in Xinjiang province and even in Mongolia to some extent. So they have lots of internal political issues that they always need to keep under control, which is why they have this massive surveillance state. to have that surveillance state costs a lot of money, costs trust between people and the government. It means they need to have a big military security system to remain their dominance. So I think the threat of Chinese dominance has been over-exaggerated as well. What has been happening even before this virus has been that companies have left China for Vietnam, for Indonesia, for Malaysia. The Chinese are not the only ones in the world who could sell cheap labor. And ironically, the average Chinese earns more than the average South African at the moment. So Chinese labor has gone up. And if they cannot reform the industrial base to become a more service-based economy, which I think they've been looking into, the factories will be leaving China. And the factories were leaving China already. You had Chinese companies opening up factories in Ethiopia, for example, before this pandemic. And I suspect that the world's global supply chains will be more decentralized. I think one country to look out for is Mexico and Chile, where they've got lots of manufacturing coming. It's closer to home to the US, shorter distances, easier logistics, culturally maybe easier to deal with in China. And a lot of countries have been decoupling. I mean, I work in a multinationalist company, and we do projects in Russia. We couldn't get spare parts from China during this crisis in December and January. So we just got it from Vietnam. And now they have to win back their market. So the Chinese are in a difficult position. First of all, the virus came from China. They've got difficult human rights violations. People don't trust them. And there are other countries now that can produce at the same cheap cost as China. Then also you have in America coming now. Ironically, the Republicans are pushing this. They're pushing for antitrust legislation to break up big monopolies to try and get manufacturing also to come back to the United States. So maybe we might move into an era of a bit more protectionism. Now, from an economic point of view, protectionism has always got problems for the consumer, increases consumer prices. But maybe the Americans are arguing that it's maybe worth paying a little bit of more money to have things manufactured at home in case there's a new crisis.
And seeing as the lockdown and the pandemic and COVID-19 has really taken over the fear aspect of what people envisioned would be the end of the world. Before that, that crown was held by global warming or climate change. And interesting enough, now that we're talking about models and projections, they also see, and we talked a little bit about this on my Afrikaans podcast. There seems to also be a change in the wind there in regards to what people said and projected the future would look like in terms of energy and what we're actually seeing in practice around the world today. I mean, you in France compared to what's happening in Germany, I think you're experiencing this firsthand.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be careful with that prediction because Emmanuel Macron now said this week that he's driving the ecologist agenda again. It's like a religion. So don't think that people have lost their convictions because there was a virus. I think it's just, some ways it's hardened them. But I'll say this on the energy project. Go watch Michael Moore's Planet of the Humans. It's hilarious to see what a scam many of these energy projects were. So you look at solar energy. How do you make solar panels? You need quartzite and coal. So by supporting solar energy, you're supporting coal inherently. Wind energy, the wind doesn't blow always, the sun doesn't always shine. The Germans tried this week. I think they shut down their nuclear power station, I think a month ago or something. This week they had to open up a coal power station to supply it. Because there's an amazing thing, when you look at energy policy, you need to look at your cost per kilowatt hour, energy density. How much energy you get out of a gram of molecule, a gram of substance. And at the moment, the energy of the future is going to be natural gas. It's cheaper, it's cost efficient, and it produces fewer carbon dioxide, less carbon dioxide than coal does. I studied nuclear energy. In my view, nuclear energy is not economically viable at the moment. It might be because of the innovations coming, small modular reactors. There's lots of talk, but we haven't seen it yet. And then the other thing is nuclear energy has to operate under a very strict regulatory framework, which pushes up prices. So I suspect that the natural gas transition is going to be accelerated.
And something specific there in France and compared to Germany is that Germany went on this green project where they diverted billions of their government revenue into trying to develop this green future and this green transition. And you mentioned something on the podcast about France just saying, well, you guys can do the experiment and we're just going to wait in the wings and see what happens.
Yeah, so, they say the shortest book ever written is about French war heroes. Napoleon was probably the last one they had. But I think the longest book that is going to be read is about French diplomatic victories. The French are very good at negotiating. So what they did is they went to the EU when the Germans came with what was called the Energiewende, the energy transition. And the Germans said, we're going to close down post-Fukushima all nuclear power stations, and we're going to have solar and wind power the world. And this just didn't work. And the French said, you know what, in principle, we are with you guys. We support it, but we just want to see how it plays out in Germany. And as soon as the Germans realized they don't have enough what we call baseload capacity, they had to buy energy from the French. So the French are now selling nuclear power to the Germans. So they're very good at negotiating. They just got one on to them. The same happened in Italy, I believe. In Spain, they stopped closing down their nuclear power stations because they realized it was a mistake. I also don't see why you need to mothball a nuclear power station if there's still 20 or 30 years lifetime on it. You can do it afterwards if you're really against the energy. But the Germans just did it because it's a one-size-fits-all policy. So I think Angela Merkel made a big mistake. And the French were ready for them in terms of negotiations.
See here, IZA says a great article by Michael Schellenberger from May 2020. We unpacks how the Germans have seen the whole renewable energy move failed and how they are going to go back to coal and dirty energy. I've actually read that article. Fascinating stuff.
It's basic simple. I mean, the simple thing was that the amount of solar panels you need to match an energy power station is enormous. I don't have the number. Yes, it has gotten a little bit more efficient. And then you need the sun to shine always. Then you need to store the energy. You know, these things add cost. So if you look at the price to consumer, that's what you need to look at in all these countries. Germany's price to the consumer has gone up. In France, they tried to increase its fuel tax years or two years ago, and they had the Gilets jaunes riots. Because as soon as you increase a small tax like that on energy consumption, you actually, depress the wages of the lower base in society. So in my view, the energy of the future, it might be nuclear, but I suspect natural gas is going to be much more competitive, especially with the LNG technology, liquefied natural gas in the United States. This is also why the US doesn't need the Middle East anymore. They don't need oil. They've got their own natural gas, and it's cheaper, and they produce it much better.
But now to really tie this all together, I mean, the title of the stream is When the Experts Get It Wrong. And I mean, in both these cases, in the COVID-19 case and in the green energy case, we've pretty much highlighted that. But I think the central question still remains, why is there this tendency, for example, for us to get things so horribly wrong? I mean, in the COVID-19 case, you explained it was the over-reliance on models and projections. But in the case of, for example, green energy, was it just ideological position? Was it just people being too utopian? What made us lose our way in this regard?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a bit of ideology there as well. But I'm reading an interesting book now about dispersion by Joel Kotkin, who's a city planner. And he says, despite densification and smart cities, people are moving to the countryside worldwide. And he makes the point that you've got an inner city elite staying in Paris, New York, San Francisco, all these places who are totally out of touch of reality with people who want to be more of a community-based people. And I suspect that the inner city elite people are people who deal in ideas. They are the creative class. They're computer coders, they are financial people, they are, artists, musicians, but they're not practical people who work with their hands. And they, unfortunately, are driving the culture and the policies. And when you have that, you have, in my view, a elite class worldwide, which now resembles Versailles in the 17th century. All they talk about is who slept with who, and it's basically gossip. They're dealing in gossip. Who slept with the king, I think it was at the time. So you've got this elite class, and then the reality is that you've got mostly middle class people worldwide who just cannot see the practicality, and they feel that they are out of the structures that they've got. It just doesn't respond to their needs. So unless there's big structural reform worldwide, I feel like we're going to see more of this thing where you've got policy being detached from reality.
And I think this is nowhere more evident than with the lockdown, specifically in South Africa. I think I made a point that something that really, I mean, not a lot of things I would say this. It sounds like you're morally grandstanding, but there is something incredibly disgusting about people that still earn a wage and income, saying, "But you guys were in this together. We just need to tough it out. We can't end the lockdown now. People can't go to work because then people will die." I think there's just something really slimy about that.
Yeah, I wonder if these people are sincere. I mean, I have to take them on their word, but I think it's just, political grandstanding. It's just moralistic appeasement. I mean, the reality is, I said this on Jeremy Nell's show the other day, When I eat breakfast in the morning, somebody has to deliver that food. The inherent assumption is that somebody probably died delivering that food, because truckers die every year. So for me to eat breakfast, I accept people will die. If you want to put it cold and callous like that. So the reality is there's risk everywhere in life. Whether you open the economy, whether you close it down. And the question is, how do you balance the two? You have to have a proportionate argument. But the politicians are making an argument against harm. They're saying we want to reduce harm to absolutely zero. It's just impossible.
But as we talked about Niall Ferguson earlier and his projections, is that where this idea came from that you hear in the public discourse about if we open it up now, we're going to have refrigerated trucks full of bodies and mass graves? Is this coming from that initial projection?
There's another source for that, which I think is more likely, which is the Spanish flu. Most people who died during the Spanish flu died during the second wave, not the first wave. Cities like Philadelphia, for example, did have a lockdown. So lockdown is nothing new. And a lockdown did seem to not have everyone infected. But what people forget is that most people that died during the Spanish flu died not because of the virus, but because of the bacteria, because there were no antibiotics. We don't live in those times. We've got better treatment, better medication. So the fear of a second wave is now what they're talking about. But there's a study done by, I think it was by JP Morgan, one of their scientists, and they look at all the countries who opened up. Every single one of them had decreased rate of transmission. Virus stayed on its course after opening up. So that's maybe unfounded. Maybe, coming next winter, there might be more cases ticking up. We might have a second wave. But I hope by then we'd be better prepared to deal with it.
But now the other thing I think that is the important question is, do you think that if we look at, for example, South Africa and also at the rest of the world, do you think that people or the experts that got it wrong, to keep with the title of this episode, do you think the people that got it wrong will admit it? Do you think they will be held accountable? Or do you think this will all just fall prey again to humanity's short attention span?
So I have my doubts that the French government is going to pay any cost for this, because they're actually becoming more popular. People are now celebrating the fact that fewer people are dying in France than in the UK, for example. So they're spending it for public relations campaign. I don't know. In Germany, it's a different case. The Germans want some justice because they don't, they've got a different history. They still have living memory of being locked into their houses. And there's a big push in Germany for investigating the deaths, investigating the comorbidities. So I suspect in Germany something will come. I suspect also in the UK there will be a parliamentary investigation. I don't have any hope for South Africa. I just think it's going to be, the guys got away with it.
But then, on that same note, do you think when all these experts getting it wrong, has this increased the amount of distrust already in societies towards experts and these technocrats? Or do you think we're just going to go back to normal afterwards?
I suspect that if there's a new crisis coming, we're just going to find a new expert and he's going to tell us the same thing. I'm not very optimistic about humans changing their behavior. I think it's very constant. I just hope that people are more skeptical of models. So that's the one thing that I hope they take from this. And that I hope that people stop trusting their governments, because governments lie to you. Worldwide, every government will lie to you. The question is just how much and who's doing lying and why are they lying. What is the truth from the lie? But my first assumption is always the government lies to me, and then I look for means to trust them. And it's very difficult at the moment. So, I can only predict what will happen. I suspect there will be political fallout, however. Emmanuel Macron has lost the majority in the French House. But the French always have a tradition of chopping down the king's heads. It doesn't matter what they do. I don't know if in the UK there's going to be political repercussions. I doubt it. In South Africa, I doubt it even more. The majority of the ANC voters on the countryside, and they're politically unconscious. I don't see them changing their minds or opinion.
And I think another accomplice of some of these governments, and sometimes not given enough spotlight, is the mainstream media in some of these countries that drove this fear and this hysteria. Do you think there will be consequences in regard to how people see the media, how they consume the media, and what types of media they consume? For example, the growth of alternative media in South Africa during this time. Yeah,
that was something which was coming already. The one thing is, though, the scientific community has to adapt to what happened now. And that is that this professor Raoult said that he found more factual information on Twitter and YouTube than some of the mainstream journalists. And there are some websites with people who have got very, high-tech mathematical skills who publish information, that are accurate. It might not necessarily be a peer-reviewed journal. And in some of the peer-reviewed journals was put out very timely, very rushed, not very good quality. So the scientific community has to reframe how we do science, how what is the truth information, where's the scores, where's the polemic. That is one discussion that's going to come out of this. In terms of the media, I think people need to stop calling it social media. It is corporate media. Okay, Facebook and Twitter are companies, and they filter, and they've got their own prejudices and biases. I found Twitter to be wonderful during this pandemic. I could communicate directly with experts around the world. One such person being Michael Levitt, the South African Nobel Prize winner. I messaged him directly, and he responded, and he helped me with my mathematics to do some of the models. He doesn't know me, but that's the wonderful thing about Twitter and social media. If somebody writes a book, I write the email to them and I say, I like your book, and we talk about this. So you have this direct relationship between authors and ideas and the people who consume it. That's a wonderful thing about social media. The sad thing, though, is that all of the nonsense on Twitter is still there. And that Twitter and Facebook was applying censorship during this whole pandemic. And they chose who the experts were. They said that the World Health Organization needs to be trusted. And if you contradict what they say, you are wrong. So one of the people who contradicted him was John Ioannidis, who's one of the most cited scientists in the world. And they took his video off. And I said to myself, maybe that guy's got a point. Somebody as popular and as good in medical research should not be taken off. Yeah. So this is something we need to learn to deal with. In America, there is something which is coming, and that is antitrust legislation, which used to be anti-monopolistic practices, are going to be enforced. And Republicans are driving it, surprisingly. Yeah. Because I think, out of political vengeance. But a lot of these big companies, Twitter and Facebook, people will have to look at their business model and ask, aren't they practicing monopolistic? What is monopolistic about them? Are they filtering traffic on certain sites? Are they blocking smaller newspapers from coming up? Are they censoring you as opposed to somebody else, who gets more ads? Yeah. Those debates we need to have.
Yeah, they're talking about it right now in the chat. IZA says, not sure if you've heard about Trump signing an executive order targeting Twitter after fact-checking Roe. Yeah, I saw that actually. Yeah,
I saw this as well. But executive orders in American politics don't mean much because Congress can just overrule them. Yeah. The American president is the weakest leader in the Western world. We should not forget that. The power lies with the Congress and the Senate.
Yeah, and I think just one final thought on the media. I think in South Africa specifically, something big has been exposed, and that the old media mantra has always been, we speak truth to power. But during this lockdown, all I've seen from the mainstream media and the corporate media is pretty much we speak praise to power, because seeing as power pays better dividends. And I've just seen journalists pointing towards people that are jogging outside and posting photos of that online. The editor of News 24 writing a piece saying that Ramaphosa's speech was majestic and now we just need to follow. This is not the type of watchdog media that they portray themselves as. This is pretty much, I think it was Noam Chomsky that said, many dictators would envy the obedience and the conformity of the American media. But I think the South African media is giving them a run for their money.
Yeah, so Noam Chomsky's book, which I recommend everyone reads, is called The Manufacture of Consent. The media essentially talks to all the experts, and they basically push an idea and they try and create public opinion for an idea which the public doesn't support. This is the idea behind them. There is something to be said that is insidious about the South African newspaper business, and that is that they have a very close relationship to power. In my view, there's not a big difference between the power relationship of News 24 and the Sowetan. It just maybe change on economic policy. But we don't have people that are distant from power. The Afrikaans newspaper's report was a lot better. I think the information was accurately and factually discussed. But let's not be under the pretension that the ANC treats the Afrikaans newspaper. You had Marula Media always being critical, a bit too community-like, or sometimes for my liking, but they had their own criticism, but more distant from power. And then the online media, Jeremy Nell and Roman Kerberak. I mean, these are not fact finders, the opinions, but their opinions probably more aligns with my biases, which is why I like listening to them. So you've got a different pool in the media, but the South African media has got a close relationship to power. I think this needs to be exposed, and whether or not their readership is falling would be an interesting question, because I suspect that it will be falling. I suspect that the reason they have this close relationship is because people have been walking away. I mean, I can get the same factual content from another source and make up my own mind. And what they've been trying to do, they've been trying to give the facts and give the opinion at the same time, and sort of patronize their readers in a way to say this is the only acceptable views or nuances that you can believe in, and anything out of that is right wing or left wing.
Yeah, don't listen to those conspiracy theorists on YouTube. So I think this brings us to the end of our show. Hügo, thank you very much for coming on. Always very insightful to talk to you, and I don't think this will be the last time. I know you're going back to work next week, but I'm sure you'll still be putting your opinions out there in some form. I know you write for the Rational Standard occasionally, so I'll be looking out for that. Do you have any final thoughts before we say goodbye to the listeners today?
Just one on the economy. Be very skeptical of economic models that are predicting the end of times. France has now been out of lockdown for 2 weeks, and it looks like it's back to normal for most businesses. So be very careful that, I hope that's the case everywhere. I doubt it. South Africa is a different economy and things. But be very skeptical to give politicians power to try and address the problems of the economy, because they created it.
Well, I think that's an excellent way to end it. A cautionary note there from Mr. Hügo. So thank you very much for everyone that tuned in. I really appreciate it. It's a strange, unorthodox time. It was 11 in the morning, but necessity was driving this. So thank you very much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this chat, leave a like. It helps out a lot. And if you're new to the show, subscribe if you like this type of content and want to see more. Next week, I will be back with more interviews and more episodes of The World Must Know that I will be uploading. And I'll check you on the next episode. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, guys. And I hope you buy yourself a nice lekker dop on Monday.
Yeah, thank you very much.
All right. Cheers. Have a good one.